It began with a door that didn't belong on any official building. No flag, no plaque. Just a single black envelope slipped under her office door at 3:12 a.m., sealed with wax and stamped only with 3 letters. JRC. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch when she read it. She didn't call anyone, didn't post a thing. She just folded the envelope into her coat pocket and told her assistant she'd be out for the day. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that the location listed on the back wasn't in any official court database. She'd been summoned not to a courthouse, but to a building that looked more like a repurposed bank vault. No press, no docket, no legal team allowed. A silent car picked her up 6 blocks from Capitol Hill. The driver never spoke, never looked back. Jasmine didn't ask questions. She just watched the city blur by, knowing deep down that whatever was waiting for her wasn't about justice. It was about control. When the car stopped, the doors didn't unlock until a second vehicle pulled up behind it. 2 plainclothes security officers stepped out, not in uniform, but in suits stitched to conceal. Jasmine recognized the type. Intelligence, not law enforcement. They escorted her into the building wordlessly, through a series of narrow hallways with no windows, and into a stark, echoing room that looked like it had been forgotten by time. A long table. 1 microphone. 5 chairs on a raised platform. 4 of them were already occupied, and not a single face was familiar. But it was the 5th man, seated dead center, that made her breath catch. She'd only seen him once, at a ceremonial swearing in nearly a decade ago. He was older now, his posture more rigid, but the presence was unmistakable. A former federal judge turned special ethics examiner, a position created during the post-Patriot Act era, then quietly buried after public backlash. Yet here he was, presiding over a closed procedural review. And Jasmine? She was the defendant. No press. No public record. And no attorney allowed inside. Just a printed statement taped to the desk in front of her. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, accused of using public trust for private narrative gain. She didn't even know what that meant. She reached for the microphone to speak. The judge raised his hand. This is not a space for speeches. His voice didn't echo it sliced. The walls swallowed sound like a vacuum. Jasmine's hand froze midair. For a moment she sat still. Then she reached into her briefcase and placed a small leather folder on the table. She didn't open it. Not yet. The panel began questioning her, one by one. But it wasn't questioning. It was accusation dressed in bureaucracy. Why was your name listed on charitable grants from a nonprofit you endorsed? Did you knowingly appear at fundraisers where campaign language was used? Is it true your community initiative had ties to activist organizations that later protested a judicial ruling? Each question was framed like a no-win trap. Answer yes, guilt by association. Say no, you're lying or ignorant. They weren't looking for truth. They were building a narrative. A version of Jasmine where her work was a front, her advocacy a brand, her voice a threat. And still, she didn't speak. Because Jasmine had learned something most people never get the chance to understand. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is resistance waiting for its moment. When the so-called hearing concluded without a single piece of actual evidence shown, they delivered their verdict. You are hereby disqualified from holding any elected office for the next 10 years. No appeal. No record of deliberation. Just a judgment as sharp and cold as the room itself. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't ask to respond. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But under the table, her fingers tightened around the folder she'd placed earlier, the one they hadn't noticed. The one wrapped in black twine and sealed with a red sticker that read, "For record reversal." Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't the story they were writing. She was the page they forgot could rewrite itself. And somewhere 3 rows behind the panel, an older woman in a faded green coat stood silently, placed a gloved hand on the wooden divider, and gave the faintest nod. That was the signal. 5 minutes later, Jasmine Crockett would rise again. But this time, not to answer questions. To ask one. The kind that rewrites history with just a sentence. There were no cameras in the room. No nameplates. Not even a court seal on the wall. Whatever this was, it wasn't justice. It was something older. Something deeper. Something meant to stay hidden. The only sound was the occasional flick of a pen from the 5 people seated above her. But even that felt rehearsed, like they'd been instructed to act human just enough to keep up appearances. The central figure, the man presiding, wore no robe, only a dark tailored suit with a black tie. No name, no title, no introductions had been made when Jasmine was let in. But his face, it carried the weight of someone who'd ruled without public consequence for years. He was what the inner circle called a shadow magistrate. Not a myth, not a rumor, but a man who hadn't appeared in any official record, photograph, or publication in over 15 years. He wasn't part of the judiciary in any official sense. He was part of what insiders whispered as the holdover panel. The legal mechanisms kept off books, but always at the ready, when the system felt threatened by someone it couldn't control. And today, that threat was Jasmine. She sat at a table built too low, making her physically smaller than everyone above. A tactic, she knew. Psychological architecture. They wanted her to feel out of place, like she didn't belong. But what they didn't realize, she'd grown up in rooms that told her the same thing. And she never backed down in any of them. When the proceedings resumed, the accusations became more abstract, more dangerous, because they were designed to be undefinable. "Congresswoman," the magistrate said without lifting his eyes, "you are accused of leveraging public trust to amplify personal influence under the guise of community service." He said it as if it were written law. But Jasmine-trained attorney, constitutional scholar, and former prosecutor knew better. That charge? It didn't exist. Not in any federal statute. Not in any ethics manual. Not even in the wildest interpretation of misconduct codes. But here, in this courtroom without a court, it was enough to destroy careers. "You've taken part in events that were marketed as nonprofit initiatives," another panelist added, "but later broadcasted through political channels. Do you deny using your platform to emotionally charge the public on issues under current federal litigation?" Jasmine didn't answer, because the only real question in the room was who gave them the authority to ask. They weren't just coming for her. They were coming for the blueprint. She represented a woman in power without permission. A black woman who spoke plainly, voted loudly, and didn't ask for a seat. She took it and earned it. And for that, they had written a new kind of charge. One that couldn't be challenged in open court, because it didn't belong in court to begin with. They called it public trust manipulation. A phrase so vague, it could mean anything. And that was the point. Because if you can't define it, you can never prove you didn't do it. But Jasmine knew something they didn't. She wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to make them speak, to push their process so far into absurdity, it would crack from within. So she waited, calm, measured. And then, she gently reached into her bag and pulled out the black folder she'd placed earlier. Not to open it. Not yet. She slid it 1 inch forward on the table. Just enough so they'd see it. Just enough to change the temperature in the room. Because the moment she let them notice it, she saw it. A flicker. In the eye of the shadow magistrate. Fear? Number? Recognition. He'd seen that folder before. He thought it had been destroyed. But now, it sat between them like a lit match, waiting for oxygen. The magistrate raised his hand again, curt, dismissive. "Let the record show," he said. "The accused has chosen not to respond." Jasmine leaned back slightly in her chair. She didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She didn't speak. Because she had already learned what speaking too soon could cost. What they didn't see, what the cameras would have missed if there were any, was what happened behind her eyes. The moment his hand cut her off, Jasmine was no longer in that room. She was 19 again. Back in Dallas. Late fall. A cracked sidewalk under her shoes. And the familiar hum of a neighborhood too tired to complain. She had been filming. Not with a fancy camera, just a borrowed phone. Recording her neighbor's house being bulldozed at dawn. The family still inside. The notice had come only 36 hours earlier. Jasmine had shown up to help them move, but the city didn't wait. The trucks arrived early, and when the front door opened, she hit record. That was it. That was the crime. They cuffed her before she could finish uploading the clip. No warrant, no Miranda rights, no phone call. Just 14 hours in a back room of a precinct that didn't log her in. No paperwork. No clock. No windows. She asked for a lawyer. They laughed. She asked what law she'd broken. They said, "You'll learn next time not to point your camera at the wrong people." By the time they let her out, the demolition was over. The house was gone. The video? Deleted. The family? Displaced. And Jasmine? She said nothing to the press. Not then. Because back then, she still believed the system could fix itself if she just worked hard enough. But now, sitting under fluorescent lights surrounded by silence wearing suits, she knew better. The courtroom she was in now wasn't that different from the cell she sat in back then. Same indifference. Same cold chairs. Same attempt to make her small. So she didn't respond to their games. She waited. Because silence, when chosen, can be a weapon sharper than sound. And she'd already learned. If you let them write the story for you, the next girl doesn't even get a page. That's why she didn't fight back today. Not yet. Because her fight was never about this room. It was about every room that would come after. And if she didn't stand her ground now, someone like her wouldn't get the chance to later. She felt it before she saw it. A soft brush against her elbow so light it could have been a breeze. Jasmine turned slightly, just enough to catch movement in her peripheral vision. In the last row of the gallery, a woman in a long green coat stood silently. She looked like someone's grandmother. No badge, no phone, just a cane in one hand, and in the other, a silver envelope. It shimmered under the courtroom lights not. Flashy, not loud, but impossible to ignore once it was in her line of sight. The red wax seal wasn't stamped with any agency or court crest. It was marked with a single symbol, a broken scale. The gallery guard didn't move, neither did the magistrate. This woman shouldn't have made it past screening, but somehow, she had. Jasmine didn't question it. She reached back slowly, fingers brushing the cold metal seal before pulling the envelope into her lap. No one on the panel noticed. They were too busy flipping through their own documents, reading lines they'd probably rehearsed. But Jasmine knew what she was holding wasn't a protest flyer. It wasn't support. It was evidence. She broke the seal. Inside were 6 neatly folded documents, no heading, no context, just clear scans of what looked like financial transfers. She turned over the first page. A payment. $42,000. Label, Legacy Arts Fellowship Grant. Recipient. Justice number. 2. On the panel. Sender, a Shell Foundation, tied to a billionaire currently under federal investigation. Second page. A painting. Modern abstract, framed and insured for $68,000. Labeled, Personal Gift Non-Liquid Asset. Recipient? Justice number. 4. Given 2 weeks before he ruled on a zoning law that protected luxury developments. Third page. A full scholarship package, confidential donor. $127,000 to a private conservatory in New Hampshire. Recipient's relation? Granddaughter of presiding judge. She didn't blink. Didn't breathe too deeply. Because what she held in her hands wasn't scandal. It was currency. Not stolen given. By names no one says aloud, but that every corridor of power knows by heart. Jasmine scanned each sheet twice, letting the dates settle into her mind like coordinates on a map. She looked up at the panel. 3 of them. 3 of the 5. All sitting with their hands folded, pretending the air wasn't about to shift. But Jasmine no longer saw them as judges. She saw them as lines in a ledger. And the silver envelope? It wasn't just a lifeline. It was a mirror. The kind no robe could hide from. She closed the envelope, slid it gently under her folder, and straightened her back. They thought they'd dragged her into a room with no exits. They were wrong. She'd just found the door. She didn't stand with a dramatic gesture. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even clear her throat. She simply waited stone still until the magistrate looked up from his notes and gave a half nod, as if granting a mercy. "You may respond," he said, dismissive. Jasmine reached for the folder in front of her, not the silver envelope, but the plain one, the one she'd placed down before they'd even started speaking. Her hand moved with purpose, like someone who wasn't here to argue, but to end a charade. "I don't need to defend myself," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It carried like steel over glass. "I'm not here to ask for fairness. I'm here to present clarity." She tapped a button on the small screen built into the witness desk. The lights dimmed. The first image appeared on the projection wall behind the panel. A still photo. High resolution. Undeniable. A man justice number. 2 leaning against the railing of a private yacht. Champagne glass in hand. Mediterranean cliffs rising in the background. The yacht? registered to a corporate litigant whose case passed through his hands just months ago. No one in the room moved. Even the clerk at the back stopped typing. Jasmine didn't explain the image. She didn't have to. She clicked again. Second slide. A document. Internal use only. Stamped. Restricted, do not circulate. Signed clearly by the very judge presiding over her hearing. The memo outlined discretionary guidelines for non-disclosure of gifts, deemed non-monetary in perceived value. Jasmine let the room breathe. Not for drama. For exposure. I've been accused of using public trust to elevate personal status, she said calmly. But what do you call it when a judge accepts undisclosed travel, private education funding, and art labeled as appreciative gifts from people with federal interests then rules in their favor? Her eyes didn't flinch. Click. Third slide. A spreadsheet. 7 cases. 3 names. Each column linked a ruling to a gift event tuition, watches, trips, dates, values, signatures. All real. All here. All ignored until now. The silence inside the room was no longer professional. It was haunted. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. I was told this room existed to protect the people's faith in the system, she said. But if this is protection, then who protects us from you? She didn't ask, am I guilty? She asked, why isn't anyone investigating you? The air shifted. One of the younger clerks coughed. A panelist reached for his water but didn't drink. The magistrate's fingers tapped the bench, offbeat and tight. Because this wasn't an accusation anymore. It was an audit, and the auditor was no longer seated beneath them. She was standing in front of them, eyes level, fearlessly composed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't defending her name. She was redefining the balance in the room. And for 90 seconds, truth stood taller than power. The magistrate opened his mouth, likely to reclaim control of the room, but it was too late. Before a single word left his lips, a voice from the back cut through the silence. Calm, measured, uninvited. If I may. All heads turned. A man in a gray suit stepped forward. No title, no badge, no theatrics. Just gravity. I'm Reuben Glass, he said, former internal coordinator for judicial scheduling and travel disclosures. The name hit harder than expected. Jasmine recognized it immediately. She remembered his name from a footnote buried deep in an old ethics inquiry. He was the staffer who'd resigned without a word. Or so everyone thought. The magistrate tensed. This proceeding is not open to. Glass raised a hand not in defiance, but with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. I was dismissed without cause 2 years ago, he said, after I refused to remove an entry from the justice's international travel calendar. He looked directly at the panel, specifically at the man in the center. The entry listed a 7-day private excursion aboard a yacht docked in Palermo. The trip was funded documentadas, a personal goodwill tour. But I recognized the names on the guest manifest. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it gently on the clerk's table. The names, he said, voice low but unwavering, included corporate litigants, individuals, and entities who had active cases in this judge's court. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was surgical. For a moment, no one breathed. Even the security officers by the door had stopped shifting their weight. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She just waited. Because this was the moment. The magistrate's eyes flickered not with rage, but panic. Subtle, but real. The kind that no black robe could conceal. Glass continued. I was told to delete the records to preserve neutrality. When I declined, my access was revoked within hours. A week later, I received notice of termination for administrative inefficiency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He reported. Because the truth doesn't need to shout when it's undeniable. And somewhere beyond that room, a live stream video, secretly captured from someone's hidden phone, had already begun to circulate. First in group chats, then in legal subforums, then across the platform known as X. Within 30 minutes, it hit #1 trending. Captioned with a single question. If judges aren't above the law, why are we watching one run from it? What began as a private hearing had just become a national reckoning. And for the first time in the entire proceeding, Jasmine didn't need to say a word. Because the story was speaking for itself. The magistrate didn't say a word. No denial. No objection. No desperate reaching for the gavel that had once silenced rooms with a single strike. Instead, his hands, those same hands that pointed, pressed, and ruled, without challenges, lowly dropped from the edge of the bench to his lap. They didn't tremble. Not yet, but they weren't steady either. He looked around the room. Once, this chamber bowed to his presence. Now, no one met his gaze. Jasmine sat calm, unshaken, folder closed, her eyes steady not on him, but through him, like he was no longer the center of the story. Because he wasn't. The story had shifted. The floor beneath him had cracked. And in that fracture, something vital had escaped belief. Power only works when people believe in it. But belief was gone. The magistrate's mouth parted, as if to speak. But there was nothing left to say. No spin. No salvaging. No shield thick enough to survive the weight of what had just been exposed. So, he stood. Not quickly, not defiantly. It was the slow, reluctant motion of a man trying to preserve a shred of control and failing. He didn't ask to be excused. He didn't declare recess. He didn't utter so much as a farewell. He just turned and walked away. Past the flags. Past the clerk's stunned stare. Past the panelists frozen in place. Each step echoed like a confession. Soft, deliberate, final. No courtroom officer moved to stop him. No aide followed. Even the reporters behind the frosted glass held their breath, as if afraid that sound might crack what little illusion of dignity remained. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. Because she knew this wasn't the collapse of power. It was something rarer. It was power choosing to flee from the light. He wasn't defeated. He was exposed. And exposure, to someone who thrived in shadows, was worse than any sentence. By the time the door clicked shut behind him, the room had transformed. The bench and say, towering, untouchable, stood empty. And all eyes turned, not to the exit, but to the woman still seated at the defendant's table. The one who never raised her voice. The one who never begged. The one who simply outlasted the lie. She didn't rise for applause. She didn't seize the empty bench. She simply sat where they had tried to silence Herond, raised her hand. Not a fist. Not a wave. 3 fingers. Held steady, not for performance, but for precision. The room didn't move. The press didn't speak. Even the clerks leaned forward as if pulled by something weightier than duty. Jasmine Crockett looked out not just at the courtroom, but at every unseen witness now watching from across the country. And she spoke not with defiance, but with clarity sharpened by everything she'd just endured. This isn't about one hearing, she said. This is about a structure that forgot who it's supposed to serve. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't preach. It carried like a verdict. So let me propose 3 things. Not someday, not eventually, but now. She lifted her first finger. 1. Every judge in this country, federal, state, or circuit, must disclose all gifts, financial perks, or sponsored travel, publicly every quarter. Not annually. Not buried in ethics reports. Transparent. Searchable. Traceable. Murmurs stirred in the room. Jasmine didn't pause. 2. A second finger rose. Whistleblower protections for those inside the judiciary clerks, schedulers. Legal aids must be absolute, not optional, not discretionary. If they come forward, they're protected. Period. Because without them, corruption breathes in silence. There was a shift in the air now, not resistance. Recognition. And then the third finger. 3. An independent judicial oversight council, nonpartisan, publicly funded, and completely outside the reach of the executive and the Senate. Because no robe, no title, and no bench should ever be immune to scrutiny. She lowered her hand slowly, letting the weight of the words land without rush. These aren't demands, she said. They're repairs. To a system that's been leaking trust for far too long. Silence held the room, not like before when it was weaponized to intimidate. This silence was reverent. Even the court recorder, normally stone-faced and mechanical, looked up from her keyboard with glassy eyes. Because they all knew. This wasn't a performance, it was a blueprint. And it hadn't come from consultants, lobbyists, or backroom strategy sessions. It came from a woman who was supposed to be destroyed. Instead, she sat at the very table they tried to shame her from, and rewrote the rules. not to win. To protect the next person who wouldn't be allowed to speak. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't need to. It happened in a folding chair town hall, tucked inside a dusty recreation center outside Dallas. The kind of place where the ceiling fans rattle louder than the microphones, and the coffee comes in foam cups with names written in Sharpie. Jasmine sat at the front of the room, not behind a podium, but beside a corkboard covered in community flyers. No cameras, no press, just neighbors. The room was quiet, not tense or reflective. She had just finished answering a question about the reform proposals, her tone calm, her words direct. No drama, no fire, just conviction. That's when the voice rose from the back row. It belonged to an older woman in a moss green coat. Her cane clicked gently as she stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You didn't take down that man," she said. The room fell still. Jasmine turned, not startled, but attentive. Present. The woman's gaze was steady, but kind. "You took down the silence we've lived under for 40 years. Her words hung in the air, not as opinion, but as truth long overdue. No applause followed, no cheers, just nods. One by one, heads began to bow and rise against them slowly, others without hesitation. Recognition doesn't need volume. It just needs space to speak. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She didn't have to. Because in that one sentence, the fight she'd endured had been named not as personal vengeance, but as a shared release. She hadn't destroyed someone. She had dismantled the expectation that no one would dare. And for the first time in a long time, the people in that room didn't feel voiceless. They felt seen. It started as a whisper. A phrase scribbled on the back of a protest sign, then a tweet, then a screenshot. Within 24 hours, it had crossed oceans. Within 4 days, it was printed on 14 million t-shirts, stitched into tote bags, spray painted on school walls. She wasn't allowed to speak. So she spoke louder. Not louder in volume. Louder in truth. The kind of loud that doesn't need a microphone. The kind that echoes in classrooms, courtrooms, and kitchen tables. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't win by dominating the room. She won by refusing to leave it in silence. They told her she couldn't speak. They cut her off. They tried to bury her under procedure, power, and protocol. But she understood something deeper, something most never dare to test. When you speak from integrity, they can take the mic, but not the message. And when she stood not with fury, but with receipts, with poise, with 3 fingers raised, she didn't just survive the system, she rewired it. Her proposals didn't end in applause. They ended in legislation. Her story didn't trend for a week and disappear. It entered syllabi, case law discussions, ethics panels, and public memory. And maybe that's what justice really looks like in the modern world. Not gavel drops and photo ops, but one person cornered, outnumbered, underestimated, choosing to speak anyway. Not because she believed she'd win, but because she knew staying silent would be worse. Now, her sentence is etched, not in marble, but in momentum. She wasn't allowed to speak. So she spoke louder. And because she did, millions now know. There is no such thing as a powerless voice. Only voices the powerful prey will stay quiet.